The 19th century is ebbing away. In the heart of Europe, old dynasties hold on to power. It's a stable, certain, but unequal world. Most ordinary people still accept that it's their place to toil and not to share, to serve and not to question. All that is about to change. A 17-year-old Russian boy saw the 20th century begin.
There were fireworks. There was drinking. There were crowds on the streets. Nobody stayed at home. People started hugging, kissing, making friends and making resolutions. We had huge hopes.
In the new century, some of those hopes were dashed, and many were realized. For millions, there was spiraling danger and cruel abuse. But political power shifted. New freedoms were won, and millions lived longer, healthier, and more prosperous lives than they'd ever expected. This series is the story of those turbulent changes, told by the people themselves.
In my century, we've had electricity, trams, cars, right up to astronauts. This is all my century. It's been fascinating. I'm very pleased with my century.
In 1900, people in the great cities of the West were proud of their achievements and confident of their future. There was rivalry between the European nations, but through careful diplomacy, they'd avoided war for 30 years. And on both sides of the Atlantic, most assumed this peaceful stability would continue.
I would say you had the feeling, well, this is the way it is, this is the way it will always be. Why would it be different? I never dreamed the world would change the way it did.
The Great Paris Exhibition of 1900 symbolized the hopes of the new century. It drew over 50 million visitors. People believed nations could now compete peacefully and avoid war. Education would reach the masses. Science would transform life at work and at home. Arriving by steam train and horse-drawn bus, visitors could make their way round the exhibition on the newest forms of transport.
Je me souviens très bien de l'exposition de 1900.
I remember the 1900 exhibition. I was 6 years old. I saw these people moving forwards without walking, and it puzzled me. So I asked my mother, and she told me it was a moving pavement, the first ever.
C'est le premier trottoir roulant qui existe. Alors ça m'intéresse.
I thought it was really interesting, and I remember it to this day.
Jusque maintenant.
The ingenious pavement swept people to huge pavilions where nations competed to show off their industrial might. Britain brought the heavy engineering that had made her the leading industrial power for so long. The Germans exhibited their latest machine tools and cars. The United States displayed the growing wealth of the new world power that was now overtaking Europe. Her production efficiency was driving up wages to make American workers the envy of the world. One building was a temple to the energy expected to power the new century. It drew enormous crowds, amongst them Raymond Abescal.
At home we used oil lamps and candles. We didn't have electricity. So here was this whole exhibit devoted to electricity. It was wonderful to see the building all lit up in the evening.
A new piece of music, Waltz of the Lights, was played in electricity's honor. And in Paris in 1900, many had their first sight of the new invention that would transform popular entertainment. Moving pictures in color. The exhibition was held at a time of growing prosperity for many, but not for all.
The Belle Époque was for the rich, people who could dress well and eat well, while your workers got nothing but stewed grease and gristle. It wasn't the Belle Époque for everybody.
C'était pas la Belle Époque pour tout le monde.
Further down the Seine, the poor were occupied with the effort of daily survival. Average life expectancy was 46. Families had to fend for themselves. If they were homeless or out of work, they received no help from the state. The world was a less crowded place. Its population would grow 4 times over in the next 100 years. And most still lived on the land, working in drudgery. Few ever glimpsed the remote political figures or monarchs who ruled their lives. But just occasionally they did.
I saw Queen Victoria. She passed by in a landau. Just a little old lady in a black cape and a black bonnet. My cousin says, "Oh, that's the old Queen." And then I was there again when she died. I was about 5, I think. And I heard the church bell tolling. I was playing in the yard. And I said, "Oh, church bell's tolling." And Auntie, she said, "Oh, the poor old dear's gone at last."
The solemn state funeral held for Queen Victoria in 1901 was a reminder of all that hadn't changed politically, even at a time of material progress. Two kings, 2 emperors, 24 princes, and 13 royal dukes followed her coffin. This was the old order. A handful of European dynasties, all related to one another, held sway over half the world. The British Empire was largest of all. A cornerstone of national life, it gave people a feeling of superiority over foreigners.
We were sorry for them in a way. And of course if we saw a coloured man, hey, watch out, he's a darky. Yes. Yeah, we were very, very, very insular. Very insular. We felt a kind of pride in that empire. The empire in which the sun never sets.
The proudest possession was India. 290 million Indians had their country run for them by an elite of 5,000 British officials. Africa too was under European domination, the imperial powers competing to exploit its mineral wealth. The Africans themselves were valued only for their labor. They had no real rights. In South Africa, the Dutch and the British had pushed the Africans off their traditional land. Dora Ramotibe worked for a Boer farmer in the Transvaal.
You had to crawl on your knees as you went up to the Boer. You had to crawl, clapping your hands.
Yeah.
The boss used to thrash us. He used to beat us women up a lot, as if we were children. He slapped us and threw us to the ground. He kicked us with his shoe and then told us to stand up. It was a painful life, very, very painful.
Young people's chances of a better life depended on who they were and where they lived. Western children were growing up healthier thanks to improved hygiene. They were better educated than any generation before, as governments brought in free, compulsory education. As more could read, the more they learned about the world. Mass literacy became the greatest single factor in changing people's expectations for their lives. New kinds of newspapers were pitched at this better educated public and sold in their millions. They brought politics to the masses. The largest example of a working democracy was the United States, where all men over 21 had the vote. At elections, politicians now appealed directly to the people.
The principles for which we stand are the principles of fair play and a square deal for every man and every woman in the United States.
The American people regularly voted their leaders in and out of office.
Politics was really hot. You really were a Democrat or a Republican. And people did business with that in their mind. Politics was really very important.
But women still couldn't vote in national elections. And there were others who were missing out. Black American men had the vote in theory, but many in the South dared not use it. John Morton Finney grew up in Missouri.
Negroes in many places could not go to the polls to vote, although the law said they had the right to do so. They couldn't go to the polls. Why? Be lynched. Man may get killed, Negro man, trying to vote.
In Europe, working men's hopes were pinned on new political parties that campaigned for their vote. Britain's Labour Party was founded in 1900. In Germany, 50 socialist MPs had been elected to Parliament. But there was one country where people had no say in how their lives were run, where discontent was most bitter. Though serfdom had ended, 90 million Russian peasants faced lives of hardship and hunger. Sergei Butsko was born in a village in Byelorussia.
Half the population lived in awful poverty. The landowner of our district lived in Warsaw. He spent all his time going to parties. Every so often he'd show up on his land to collect his money. Then he'd shoot off back to Warsaw.
Political parties were illegal. There was no parliament. Absolute power was in the hands of one family, the Romanovs. Let all know, Tsar Nicholas declared, that I shall safeguard the principles of autocracy unswervingly. The Tsar's children met their poor subjects at a charity fete, a rare bridging of the gap between the masses and their godlike masters.
My father always said life without a Tsar was impossible. No matter how hard it is for the workers, there should always be a Tsar. In my family, we never said anything against the Tsar. What they said about him at the factory, I don't know.
More and more, the talk in the factories was of how to fight the low wages and harsh conditions. Max Kleinman saw the mounting discontent at first hand.
People were dissatisfied. At the meetings they shouted, "Down with autocracy." They saw the Tsar as a symbol of autocratic rule, and saw that he held Russia tightly in his grasp, and that the people were struggling for survival.
In 1905, workers petitioned the Tsar, saying, "We have been made beggars. We are oppressed. We working men have no voice." The Tsar's reply came when his troops fired on the demonstrators. A wave of strikes spread. The clamor for political reform grew, and a small group of Marxists saw its chance to overthrow the Tsar in all-out revolution. On the barricades in 1905 was Alexander Bryansky.
We all talked and sang revolution.
Духом окрепнем в борьбе, братский союз, свободу, грудью проложим свет.
We boys took part on the barricades. I remember how we turned the horse-drawn trams onto their sides. We tipped over the tram which went through Ostrožnaja Square.
The Tsar was finally forced to promise his people their first representative assembly, the Duma. But few were satisfied. The fires of revolution were not extinguished. Only 12 years later they'd flare up again, turning Russia into the first workers' state and changing the course of history. From Japan, Russia's neighbor in the Far East, came further challenges to the old order. Only a generation before, Japan had been closed to the outside world and locked into feudalism. Japanese reformers then launched a drive to modernize and catch up with the West.
They widened the streets. When electric lighting was put in, the city got a lot livelier in the evenings.
By 1904, the Japanese felt strong enough to fight a war with Russia for dominance in the Far East. They used their new navy to sink the Russian fleet. Japan's triumph challenged the superiority over other races that white people had taken for granted. Mohei Tamura remembers the celebrations.
We pulled the drum cart through the village and celebrated for 3 days. Japan won a great victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and as a result, we didn't fear foreigners. We thought Japan was a country protected by God, and that we would never lose any wars in the future. Our belief was as simple as that, and so we had no fear of foreigners.
And they continued to borrow from the West. Mohei Tamura got a job as a salesman for European-style clothes.
I knew the world was developing dramatically, and I thought I ought to get a job adapted to this new, changing world.
Japan's new self-confidence and her growing industrial skill would help her become a new force in the world. For many Europeans, crowded into city slums, the promise of the modern age was slow to arrive. The wait for political and social improvements in their own countries seemed interminable. The most desperate were the persecuted minorities. In Russia and Eastern Europe, Jews were attacked in a series of pogroms. Despair and poverty led many to try and break with the past completely. In search of a better life, millions set out for the land they'd been told offered tolerance and prosperity, America. Some families could only afford the fare for their children, not themselves. In 1910, Nellie Gillinson sailed for New York. leaving her parents behind.
I'll never forget the goodbye of my mother. She was squeezing me and I was squeezing her. People wanted to pull me off of my mother, and my mother didn't let me go. And the same thing was and for years, when I thought about it, I was crying. But I never saw my mother or father again.
From Hamburg and Stockholm, Liverpool and Cork, Naples and Genoa, they set out on a journey few were prepared for.
The voyage was very rough, very rough. There wasn't a day that people didn't pray to arrive in America. We were in steerage. We were in steerage, like I would say a flight down in the boat. And we had bunks, double bunks. My mother and my little brother slept down, and we as two children slept on the upper bunks. It was crowded. A lot of people were very sick, especially the elderly people were sick. One day we were playing on the boat, and a sailor was sweeping the floor, and then all of a sudden he started to holler and point. He spoke in a language that I didn't understand, but he was pointing and hollering, "America, America," pointing with his finger. And we all looked, and before you know it, we saw America. We saw the Statue of Liberty.